Imagine you're sitting on a plane. Looking out the window, you can see the skyline of New York City. The plane has just climbed into the air, not yet 1,000 feet high. And then, a loud bang. A flash outside the window. A smell of something burning coming from the engines. Within seconds, both engines go dead. Silence fills the cabin. No one knows what's about to happen in the next few minutes. This isn't a scene from a movie. It really happened. On January 15th, 2009, in the skies over New York. And how this story ended became a chapter in aviation history known as the Miracle on the Hudson. In this video, we'll walk through the entire event from start to finish. How an ordinary domestic flight faced a terrifying crisis in under 5 minutes. How an experienced pilot used his training and judgment to save 155 lives. And why this is still considered one of the most successful emergency landings in the history of aviation. Let's get into it.
January 15th, 2009. New York City was gripped by winter cold, temperatures well below freezing. On a day like this, a routine domestic flight, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, was preparing to depart from LaGuardia Airport in New York, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. The aircraft was an Airbus A320, a twin-engine, mid-sized passenger jet that had been delivered new in 1999 and had served in regular commercial operation for nearly a decade. On board were 150 passengers and 5 crew members, 155 people in total. The captain of this flight was Chesley Sullenberger, known to everyone as Sully. He was 57 years old at the time, with nearly 20,000 hours of flying experience behind him. He had previously flown as a fighter pilot in the military before becoming a commercial airline pilot, and had spent decades in the cockpit. He also had deep expertise in aviation safety and had worked as a consultant on the subject. Beside him sat First Officer Jeffrey Skiles. He too had more than 20,000 hours of total flying experience, but he was still relatively new to the Airbus A320, with only a few dozen hours logged on this particular aircraft type. That day, Skiles was the one flying the plane, while Sullenberger sat beside him, monitoring and assisting. In the cabin were 3 flight attendants, welcoming passengers and going through the usual safety briefings. Among the passengers were people heading to work meetings, families traveling together, parents with small children. Everyone assumed this would be just another routine flight. They'd land in Charlotte within the hour. No one knew that the next few minutes would become the most terrifying and most unforgettable moments of.
At 3:25 in the afternoon, Flight 1549 lifted off from the runway at LaGuardia Airport. The weather that day was reasonably good for flying. Decent visibility, normal wind conditions. The takeoff itself was completely routine. The plane climbed steadily. The skyline of Manhattan was visible below. Passengers settled into their seats, reading, chatting, or simply gazing out the window. About 2 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft was climbing through roughly 3,000 feet, everything changed. A flock of Canada geese happened to be flying through the area. These birds travel in large groups, and their presence in that airspace during winter wasn't unusual. But that day, this particular flock crossed directly into the path of Flight 1549. In an instant, birds began striking the front of the aircraft, one after another. The sound was so loud that it felt to the pilots like an explosion. Visibility through the windshield was almost completely obscured. And most critically, several birds were ingested directly into both engines. Jet engines are designed to withstand the occasional small bird strike. But when multiple large birds are ingested into both engines simultaneously, the results can be catastrophic. Within seconds, both engines lost their power almost entirely. The aircraft could no longer generate the thrust it needed to keep flying normally. Sullenberger later described the feeling as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from under him. Both engines lost thrust completely, simultaneously and symmetrically.
Passengers in the cabin felt this too. Some saw flashes from the engines through their windows. A burning smell spread through the cabin. The familiar hum of the engines suddenly went silent, and that eerie silence was for many passengers the most frightening moment of all.
This is where the most crucial part of the story begins. Even after both engines failed, the aircraft continued climbing for about 19 more seconds before it began a gradual descent, a glide. At this point, the two pilots split up their responsibilities. Sullenberger took control of the aircraft, while Skiles worked to try restarting the engines. This was no simple task. There's a specific checklist procedure for restarting engines, one that's normally meant to be carried out at a much higher altitude with more time available. But they had only a few minutes, and their altitude was dropping fast. 22 seconds after the bird strike, Sullenberger radioed New York Air Traffic Control with an emergency call. In a calm voice, he reported that they had lost thrust in both engines after striking birds, and that he was turning back toward LaGuardia. The air traffic controller immediately cleared a runway at LaGuardia and gave Sullenberger clearance to land there. But within seconds, Sullenberger realized that with the altitude and speed remaining, reaching LaGuardia simply wasn't possible. He responded with a short, firm word: unable. The controller then offered an alternative, Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, which was nearby. After a few seconds of consideration, Sullenberger gave the same answer again: unable. This was the moment that called for one of the most high-stakes decisions in aviation history. There was no runway ahead, behind, or to either side.
The aircraft was now gradually descending toward the river. Sullenberger maneuvered it carefully to clear the George Washington Bridge, which spans the Hudson River, and at this altitude, avoiding a collision with the bridge itself was a serious challenge. Once past the bridge, Sullenberger made a brief announcement over the intercom to the passengers, just a few words, telling them to prepare for a hard landing. In the cabin, flight attendants quickly began instructing passengers, heads down, bodies bent forward, bracing positions, to reduce the risk of injury. Passengers held each other's hands. Some clutched photos of loved ones. Others closed their eyes and prayed. An eerie mix of calm and deep anxiety settled over the cabin. Outside, the waters of the Hudson River were rising up to meet them. On that winter day, the river's temperature was near freezing, and the outside air temperature was well below the freezing point. Prolonged exposure to water that cold could quickly bring on hypothermia. Sullenberger tried to bring the aircraft down as level as possible relative to the water's surface. He kept the nose slightly raised so the tail would make contact with the water first, a technique critical to keeping the fuselage intact and protecting the passengers.
Just before 3:30 in the afternoon, roughly 3.5 to 4 minutes after the bird strike, Flight 1549 touched down on the Hudson River. The entire sequence of events, from the moment the engines failed to the moment the plane hit the water, had lasted only a few minutes. The tail of the aircraft struck the water first. The impact caused serious damage to the rear structure, even rupturing part of the fuselage and allowing water to start flooding in. But fortunately, the fuel tanks hadn't been fully depleted, which helped keep the aircraft afloat for a while. Immediately after landing, passengers went through a terrifying experience inside the cabin. The force of impact threw many forward in their seats. Bags fell from overhead bins, and cold water began seeping in from the rear of the plane.
Now comes perhaps the most dramatic part of this entire story, the fight to get out. The aircraft was floating, but no one knew how long it would stay afloat. Water was rushing in fast from the rear, so flight attendants directed passengers toward the front doors and the emergency exits above the wings. One rear door was attempted, but the water pressure made it unusable. Passengers helped each other climb out through the slides and inflatable rafts. Many stepped straight onto the wings, which were still above the water. Standing there in wet clothes in the freezing cold, people held on to one another to keep from slipping into the river. Some passengers, fearing the plane might explode, tried to swim away from it, even though the river water was dangerously cold, making that choice even riskier for them.
Throughout all of this, Captain Sullenberger walked the length of the cabin twice to make sure every passenger had made it out safely. Only once he was certain the plane was empty did he leave it himself, last of everyone. Inside a sinking aircraft, at real risk to his own life, he made sure no one was left behind.
The Hudson River runs right through the middle of New York City, an area filled throughout the day with ferries, tugboats, and tour boats. As word of the landing spread, nearby vessels of every kind began rushing toward the scene within minutes. New York waterway commuter ferries, police boats, fire department boats, tugboats, and even Coast Guard vessels converged on the site almost immediately. As passengers stood shivering on the wings, boat after boat arrived to pull them to safety. The rescue operation moved so quickly that the first passengers were being lifted onto boats within just a few minutes of the plane touching down. With hypothermia a serious risk in such cold water, every minute mattered. During the rescue, one passenger suffered 2 broken legs, and several others experienced minor injuries or symptoms of cold exposure. But remarkably, despite the scale of the emergency, not a single person lost their life. All 155 people on board, 150 passengers and 5 crew members, were rescued alive. That number is what makes this event so extraordinary in aviation history.
News of the event spread almost instantly. A commercial jet landing in the middle of a river in New York City, with every single person surviving? This became a leading headline around the world within moments. New York's then governor, David Paterson, described it at a press conference as a day that could be remembered as one of the finest moments in the city's history. The media and the public quickly began calling it the miracle on the Hudson. But despite the word miracle, there was no magic involved. What really happened was years of training, experience, calm decision-making under pressure, and a group of people, the crew, the passengers, and the rescuers, all doing the right thing at the right time.
Naturally, an event of this scale led to a detailed investigation. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, examined every second of what had happened. Flight simulator recreations of the incident showed that, in some tests, an immediate turn back to LaGuardia might have allowed the aircraft to reach the runway. But once the simulations accounted for realistic decision-making time, the seconds a real pilot would actually need to process the situation, it became clear that neither LaGuardia nor Teterboro were reachable. This confirmed that Sullenberger's decision had been the correct one. The investigation also noted that Sullenberger activated the Auxiliary Power Unit, APU, almost immediately after the bird strike, a step that normally comes later in the standard checklist. That quick decision helped keep the aircraft's electrical systems running, which proved critical during the controlled landing that followed. The final conclusion of the investigation was that this ranked among the most successful emergency landings in aviation history. In its wake, new recommendations were made regarding engine bird strike testing standards, pilot training for dual-engine failure, and technology to help detect and avoid bird strikes in the future.
Within days, the partially submerged aircraft was lifted out of the river for examination. It had suffered extensive damage to its tail and lower fuselage, and the left engine had actually detached during the landing. The aircraft was later preserved and put on permanent display at an aviation museum in Charlotte, where it remains today. Captain Sullenberger became a national hero almost overnight. He was invited to attend President Barack Obama's inauguration. The U.S. Congress passed resolutions of praise in his honor. He threw the ceremonial first pitch at a Major League Baseball game and served as Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade in 2010. In March 2010, after 30 years as a pilot, Sullenberger retired. On his final flight, he was joined by First Officer Skiles and several passengers from Flight 1549 who came specially to see him off. The entire crew, Sullenberger, Skiles, and the 3 flight attendants, later received numerous honors together, including a prestigious award from a National Air and Space Museum and induction into an International Aviation Hall of Fame. In 2009, Sullenberger wrote a memoir about his life and this experience, which was later adapted into a major film released in 2016, directed by Clint Eastwood, with Tom Hanks in the lead role.
Even years later, the miracle on the Hudson remains etched in people's memory because it shows just how powerful calm thinking, training, and sound judgment can be in a moment of extreme crisis. This isn't a story about one person's individual heroism. It's a story of collective success. The seamless coordination between two pilots in the cockpit, the composed instructions given by flight attendants in the cabin, the swift support of air traffic control, the quick response of ordinary boat operators on the river, and passengers helping one another. All of these combined to produce what looked from the outside like a miracle. Sullenberger himself later said that calling it a miracle wasn't entirely accurate, because what really happened was the result of years of training and preparation. But to the wider public, 155 people walking away alive from such a terrifying situation still felt like nothing short of a miracle.
On the afternoon of January 15, 2009, what unfolded in the skies over New York became one of the most remarkable chapters in aviation history. An ordinary domestic flight, an unlucky encounter with a flock of birds, and the decisions made in the few minutes that followed. Together, they created a story that still inspires people today. This story reminds us how important it is to stay calm under pressure and rely on training and experience rather than panic. And it also shows how, in a moment of crisis, ordinary people, ferry operators, firefighters, everyday citizens, can come together instantly to save each other's lives. That was the complete story of the miracle on the Hudson. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel for more true stories like this one.